Hello BookTube, my name is Carrie and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing part 2 of my October wrap-up. These are the 12 books that I read in the second half of the month. In total this month I read 21 books, which, wow, that was way beyond what I was expecting for myself. I went into this month with a pretty big TBR and I am pretty grateful that I made it through what I ended up reading and that I picked up some other things along the way. And yeah, it's just been a really good reading month. I don't think that I'll be able to get through just that much in November because I have quite a few things coming up, but glad to keep the momentum at least. So the first book that I read for the second half of the month was Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata, translated from the Japanese by Ginny Takemori, and narrated by Nancy Wu. And this is the story of a young woman who she has been working at this convenience store for like 15 to 20 years of her life, and she's very happy there. She is definitely on the spectrum for autism, and the convenience store provides this routine to her that is extremely helpful. It is a safe space for her and one that she feels very comfortable in. However, a lot of her peers criticize this and criticize her line of work and her lifestyle choices, and so she is kind of grappling with what she wants to do to change her life. And this was a really short book. It was like 150 or 160 pages, but it was so lovely. The way that this character is explored in here and the way that you feel connected to her and you understand why she has made the decision she has, why she is living this life that other people criticize, and also her examination of those criticisms and her inner thought process behind these things is so well articulated in this. It was really amazing. It was a very heartfelt story and one that I ended up rating 4 out of 5 stars. Then I listened to the audiobook of A Dead Jen and Ciro by P. Djèlí Clark, and this was so out of my comfort zone. It's like a alternate fantasy world of Cairo. Is set in like the turn of the century, and there are these like monsters called Djinn and like magic and like a lot of fantastical elements that are like kind of overrunning the city, and this investigator is sent to like investigate these cases and solve these murders of these Djinns that are happening in Cairo. And this was just so bizarre but so well done. This was a novella. This and the next in the series are novellas, and then the full work is actually going to be coming out in the spring. But I'm so excited to continue on with this series. I was really blown away by the writing in this. It was such a well done story, and for such a short story as well. I think the world building was excellent in this, and I think that I will also try to listen to the second one on audiobook because the narrator was absolutely excellent. And I also rated this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I listened to Letters to a Young Poet by Reina Maria Rilke, and this was translated by Charlie Louth or Louth. I'm not quite sure on which one of those is correct. And this was narrated by Marc, Allan. This was absolutely lovely. This was the perfect fall read. I actually listened to this while I was driving back on like country roads and had just gotten like a hot chocolate. It was so nice out and just kind of rainy and lovely. The leaves were turning colors. Oh, it was so atmospheric. And this is just a series of letters that Rilke wrote to a like friend of his about like poetry and about experiencing the world, and it was just so lovely. And this is one that I think I'm gonna go back to and maybe try to read like every autumn or something like that because I just absolutely loved this. Oh, it really blew me away. Then I read The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. This was the first selection for my book buddy read club with one of my friends from college. This was her selection for the first half of the month, which I was way behind on. I ended up setting us back a little bit because I completed this in like the 3rd week of the month. But I actually read this really fast once I started it. It was so good. This is the story of a young girl named Piccola who has been kind of told her whole life that she's ugly, and she has this desire to have blue eyes. And this is about the town that she grew up in and the various people who were involved in her life, and it often switches narratives. So we first follow like these 2 sisters that she's living with, then we follow her father and her mother, and follow all these people that she interacts with, and it's just so interesting. There's a lot of characters in this, and there is a lot of like little pieces of information that are kind of dipped in here and there, and some characters go by different names. Some characters you don't directly know that that's who they're referencing, so there is a lot that you kind of have to pay attention with this, but it is just so well done. I didn't find it too difficult to follow. I felt like I was always very aware of who was being talked about and who was talking, and I was absolutely blown away with this. I cannot believe that this was Toni Morrison's first novel, because this was just absolutely amazing. And for such a difficult topic, it is a really great exploration of a lot of serious subjects, especially colorism and beauty standards that Black women are held to, and also that are experienced in their own community, and just like the dynamic of these communities that are looking out for each other, but also are very critical of one another, and kind of like the morals of the time period that this was set. It just was such a great examination of so many different things. And I actually read the afterword to this, where Toni Morrison describes the real life girl who inspired Pecola, and how this was really an internal struggle of Toni Morrison's of reconciling her identity as a Black woman. And I thought that that was such a great afterword to this, and an exploration of the importance of this book back then, but also her examining it, you know, decades after the fact, and this new reprint of this edition. So yeah, I have so much love for this book. I obviously have added quite a few tabs to it, so I am so glad that we ended up reading this one for the month. Next, I read Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I picked this up in anticipation of the Netflix movie, and having read it, I don't know if I'm gonna watch the Netflix movie. I ended up giving this only 3 out of 5 stars. I actually listened to part of this on audiobook, which is narrated by Anna Massey, and I think that if I hadn't picked up the audiobook, I would likely not have finished this. I really struggled with this. It was at a astronomically slow pace that was just unnecessary for the story. There were these everyday going-ons that had no real impact on the story. I felt like this was way longer than it needed to be. A good portion of this could have been cut down, and I didn't feel a real anticipation in this. I was definitely shocked by like the plot twist in this, and then later like another plot twist at the end, but those were like the only exciting moments, and I don't think that there was any real tension built up for it. It was just kind of like, here's a plot twist that changes everything you thought you knew about the story from this point. And I did like that plot twist. I think that it definitely added to this story and made the story interesting. But does that make up for like the unnecessary like extra 100 pages that this had? I don't really think so. So this was very average for me. Next, I read Daisy Miller by Henry James. So I officially completed this bind-up edition of Daisy Miller and the Turn of the Screw. And Henry James writing is not for me. I didn't like either The Turn of the Screw or Daisy Miller. I like Daisy Miller a little bit more than Turn of the Screw, but I still gave Daisy Miller 2 stars, so not that much above. And my biggest grievance with his writing style, at least in these 2 novellas, I can't speak for his novels, there's just no complexity to the plots in this. They are just almost unfinished in my opinion. It feels like these were concepts for a larger novel that he just didn't want to write, so he was like, I'll make it a short story, but it has no development whatsoever. There's also so much ambiguity in both of these stories' endings. In Daisy Miller, there's like a kind of conclusion, but I didn't care about the conclusion in that because it was ambiguous as to what message he was trying to send with that. And yeah, I just don't think that Henry James is for me. Next, I read Grief is a Thing with Feathers by Max Porter. This was Max Porter's first work. I previously read his second work, which was Lanny, back in September, and really enjoyed that. It was like a favorite for the season, and I was even more blown away by Grief is a Thing with Feathers. This follows a father and 2 young sons who have lost their mother, and a crow visits them to help them through the grieving process. And this was amazing. There are so many, like, I don't know if you can see, but literally almost like every page is tabbed, and I love this so much. I think that this is a really excellent examination of grief and how it differs for different people, even in the same situation and in the same family. The emotions that this conveyed and the exploration of those emotions and of this kind of physical representation of grief as this crow, and it was just so well done. Oh, I just absolutely love this. This is definitely a favorite of mine. I can't believe I've let this sit on my shelf for so many years now because this was absolutely excellent. Next I read Human Acts by Han Kang, translated from the Korean by Deborah Smith. This is the second of Han Kang's novels that I've read. I previously read The Vegetarian back when it was listed for the Man Booker International, and that was around the time that Human Acts was also being translated into English, and I actually bought it back then. I finally made my way to this one, and I was completely unprepared for this. This is the story of a group of people who are wrapped up in the Gwangju uprising, which took place in 1980 in South Korea. And this was a student uprising. It was a student protest actually that turned into what the government called an uprising, and the government brutally suppressed this. There were thousands injured in this, and a lot of really senseless and just absolutely brutal killings took place during this, along with other acts of violence. And this explores a group of people that are connected through this one boy, and this kind of build up to this uprising happened, the actual events of the uprising and what took place during that, and then also the kind of aftermath of that, and how over the next 30 years people really dealt with that aftermath. It was very difficult to read. I am not gonna lie, there are some very graphic scenes in here. It's a lot. And I think the saddest part about this whole thing is that Han Kang actually took a lot of those testimonies from actual victims who were in the Gwangju uprising. A lot of the information about killings that she puts in here, and about acts of torture, because people were arrested and imprisoned and tortured for years after the uprising. She follows characters even who go through that, and at the end of this she lists the archives and historical testimonies, oral histories that she drew from as inspiration from real cases that these things happened to. And there is such a great exploration of themes of religion and spirituality, as well as death, and how people cope with death, how people cope with trauma, how people are swept up in a revolution, and sometimes they don't even understand really what they're involved in or what the consequences of that could be. And also there's a lot about your country and how you kind of have this idealized vision of your country, but that might not necessarily be what your country is, and having to really reconcile that and figure out what do you see your country as, and what do you see your country doing in times of crisis like this. And I think this is really interesting in comparison with a lot of the protests that have been happening in the United States right now, and seeing a lot of the violence that has, that has been incited in retaliation to those protests. Yeah, it's a little sad that this is still a topical subject matter. Yeah, this was heartbreaking, but absolutely amazing. I would highly, highly recommend it, but be warned that it is a very difficult read. Then after I read Human Acts, I picked up Giovannis Room by James Baldwin. This was my selection for the Book Buddy Read Club with my friend from college, and I actually ended up DNFing this. My friend did finish it and she really loved it, but I really could not get into this. I had a lot of issues with this, specifically the characters. The main character and the main love interest I did not enjoy at all. I actually hated both of them pretty strongly. I felt like they were both extremely judgmental and hateful people. I also was just totally blown away by the self-hatred that the main character had. It was just really mind-boggling. He described a lot of older men. There is one character who I actually really enjoyed his story. He is an older character who tries to date younger men, and there is this examination of all those years that that man had to stay in the closet and had to hide his life from people, and the effects that that has kind of had on him today. And I found the main character's criticisms of that man and his hatred of this man and his lifestyle were more rooted in homophobia than anything. He compares this man to being a predator, but that's not at all really what that character was doing. On top of that, the main love interest is so misogynistic in this, and also just so horrible to people. He was so rude and so judgmental and so critical of women in the worst ways possible. I was also kind of confused as to where we were in this story, because some chapters are jumping ahead, some are flashbacks, but it's never really clarified. This just kind of felt like it was all over the place for me, and I had no investment in this. I had read up to 70% and I was like, I don't care about any of these characters. I don't care about the story. And this is a short book. I should have just realistically finished it, but I didn't want to. I had no interest in it at all. Yeah, I didn't even give it a rating because I just don't care enough about it, honestly. This was a pretty big disappointment for me because I've read a lot of James Baldwin's nonfiction, so I was sure that this was going to be a hit with me, and I just don't think it was for me. Next, I listened to the audiobook of His Only Wife by Peace Adio Medie, I believe, and this was narrated by Soneela Nankani, and this is the story of a young woman who is in a arranged marriage of sorts. He is the son of a really wealthy woman from her village in Ghana, who she refers to as Auntie because she's kind of like helped this woman and her family out over the years, and Auntie planned this marriage because she believes that her son needs to be led away from this other woman who he has kind of built a life with. He has children with this other woman. He's been seeing her for years, but her and Auntie do not get along, and Auntie's like entire family really doesn't like this woman. So our young narrator, she ends up being in an arranged marriage with Ellie, and this explores their relationship as it develops over the first few years of their marriage and the kind of ups and downs that they go through, and this kind of conflict between him being in love with someone else but married to this girl who expects him to be her husband. And this was really interesting. I could not stop listening to this audiobook. I listened to the entire thing in a day. I was just really drawn in by these characters because it almost has a gossip feel to it. You feel like you are with the characters as they're receiving information and then taking it back, and all of this like social atmosphere to it where they're going to parties, she's meeting people, and she is so conscious of this public image, and you feel so like enveloped in that. And I thought it was really interesting. I do feel that the main character was a little frustrating at times. She seemed to go back and forth between her awareness of the situation she was in and her conveniently wanting change at inconvenient moments, if that makes sense. And I felt like there was also a lot of immaturity with this main character, but also she was a younger woman. She was like, I think 16 or 17, something like that. So it is kind of expected that that was how she would react. I found this just really interesting because of the examinations of this marriage and this really difficult dynamic that this family found themselves in, but also in the kind of examinations of privilege and how when you become more wealthy, you kind of have this certain view of yourself, and people develop a certain view of you as well, and that's something that's really well explored in this. And yeah, it was just a really interesting book. I really enjoyed it. It was a 4 out of 5 stars for me. So then throughout October, I was trying to read a story a night from Classic Tales of Horror by Edgar Allan Poe, but I kind of failed at that. There were some nights where I was reading just one story at a time, but the majority of the nights I was reading like anywhere from 2 to 4 stories at a time, and I ended up finishing this a couple days before Halloween, and I really enjoyed this. This was my first time reading Edgar Allan Poe since I was in high school, which is when I was like obsessed with him, and this covered a lot of the stories that I had missed over the years, and I found some new favorites, like Ligeia and The Oval Portrait were really good ones. Overall though, there were a lot of misses in this. The majority of the stories fell between 1 to 3 stars for me. I ended up rating this like 3.5 or something like that. I think I rounded it up for a 4 just because of like the nostalgia of it, because this included 2 of my absolute all-time favorites of his stories, The Mask of the Red Death and The Cask of Amontillado. I have a certain attachment to those, so yeah. But something I will say about this is that in this edition, they didn't translate any of the parts that were like in French or Latin, which was confusing at times and very jarring because Edgar Allan Poe likes to incorporate a lot of like French and Latin into his like writings, and there was one story in particular, I can't remember which one now though, it was where like every so often there were just like random French phrases thrown in, so that was a little bit jarring because I did have to stop and like look them up, and sometimes they wouldn't like correctly translate, and so I feel like that could have just like been something they added to this. But other than that, yeah, it was a decent collection. Then I have The Five by Hallie Rubenhold. This is a nonfiction work that's a kind of collected biography of the lives of Jack the Ripper's victims. I had a lot of issues with this book. I think I might actually do a separate video just reviewing this because I have a lot of thoughts on this, and it's just too long to put in here, but there were just major issues with this. I didn't think that it really flowed that well, and I felt like the author wasn't really sure what book she was trying to write here, and it took a little too many of fictionalized liberties with this story. Then I read The Halloween Tree by Ray Bradbury. This was a book club pick for Never Too Late to Read Classics on Goodreads, and I am so glad that I picked this up. This was such a lovely Halloween read, and I think that this is going to be a classic that I try to read every Halloween now because it was really short and just such a good story. This follows a group of friends on Halloween. One of their friend group had an accident and he has to go to the hospital, and the other friends are sure that this is like some big prank that he's pulling on Halloween. So they think they see him go into this like abandoned house, and they end up following him in and meet this man named Mr. Moundshroud, and they follow him through the night as he explains the history of Halloween, and this group of friends tries to track down their friend who they think is like playing this great game and like this big mystery through the night. And it's just such a cool story. I thought it was really interesting how Ray Bradbury incorporated different cultural elements of Halloween and talked about other civilizations like through history, their traditions with Halloween and or Halloween like activities, and that was just really great, and I really enjoyed this one. It was a great way to finish off the month and I guess kind of start the month as well. Yeah, so that is the last of the books that I read in October. I hope that you guys also had a good reading month, and happy reading for November. Bye!